Hi, thank you for joining us from Paris City Hall here in the heart of the French capital. I'm Matthew Campbell, Chief Business Correspondent at Bloomberg. Joining me from COP21, the United Nations Climate Summit, is Jules Kortenhorst, Chief Executive Officer of the Rocky Mountain Institute, very respected American environmental think tank with an enormous history in climate change and other environmental issues. We are here on the occasion of an event that is about cities, really. Today is the day for local leaders, mayors. We heard from Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris. We heard from Michael Bloomberg, my ultimate employer, and the former mayor of New York this morning, and about the importance of cities in climate change. It seems like this is something that has come to the climate change discussion relatively recently. We heard a lot about nation states, a lot about international organizations, but now it's all cities all the time. Can you talk about why that is, Jules?
I think there are probably three reasons why cities are suddenly such a big part of the conversation. First of all, if you look at the global trends, urbanization continues at an incredibly fast pace, particularly in developing countries. So more and more, well over 60% of global emissions is already concentrated in and around cities. So therefore, if that's where the problem is, that's where we have to seek the solutions. Another reason why cities are important is the wonderful ability of mayors to get things done. The ability of the execution power of local governments to organize programs and implement programs that often exceeds the capabilities of national or federal governments. And then finally, if you start thinking about the solutions, so much of them are about what futures of the city will look like. Whether it is the way in which we design cities, the way in which we will accommodate new forms of mobility and urban transportation in and around cities, and then of course all the built environment, all the buildings that are such a large part of our emissions, but also such a large part of the solution. So it is where the people live, it is where the execution power sits and where we can find the solutions.
Now, what you mentioned about the built environment, I think is very interesting, because sometimes there is this perception that the way to live with a small environmental footprint, the way to live in harmony with nature is out on some farm somewhere, at one with the trees and the grass and everything else. But actually, as people in positions like yours know, the most sustainable place we could all live is in very dense urban areas where there are energy efficient large buildings, public transportation, walking, things like that. Is that something that's difficult to convince people, particularly in the US?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at the way in which urbanization and land use has emerged in the United States, it's very spread out. In the US, we all like our suburban home with a little bit of a garden around it, and we put up with this horrible commute to get us to the place where we want to work or where we want to recreate or where the rest of life takes place. So you're absolutely right that the urban design of the future is dense, is less reliant on transportation, and uses buildings not by definition as a use of energy, but as a sort of prosumer, producer and consumer of energy, as a balancing part of the electricity grid, and as a very smart tool for an efficient city. So that's a very different way of looking at urbanization than we've done historically in the US.
And you have to change the mentality a little bit. You know, when you tell people the greenest place in America is Manhattan,
yeah,
they probably don't quite believe you.
I think that's true. On the other hand, I'd say that the younger generation is very quick to pick up on that. If I look at my children who are in their late 19s, early 20s, they think of the cities as the cool places to live. They don't necessarily need a car. They don't want a car. It's not practical in the city. They are comfortable with the bike share and ride share, and they look at mobility and living in a city in a very different way than we historically did in suburban America.
Now, we're here in Paris, of course, with an enormous spectrum of officials, business people, non-governmental organizations. There is a real air of optimism that we will have some kind of deal that really does move the ball forward on climate change. What are you most encouraged by this week, and what are you most discouraged by?
So there are many things that are heading in the right direction that give me hope that we'll have a good and above all an ambitious deal by the end of next week. First of all, the role that business is playing here at the COP. In Copenhagen, governments were taking the lead and business was sort of hedging their bets and uncertain about following. Here, businesses are clearly leading and governments are trying to keep up. The second thing that gives me courage is the idea that so much of the action is now happening in emerging and developing countries. People, particularly in the United States, find it hard to believe how fast China is changing its economy to a sustainable pathway. When I tell people that China installed more solar last year than the United States over the course of history since inventing solar power.
Amazing. Yeah.
That's an amazing statistic that makes you realize that developing countries are now very much part of the solution. And then the third thing, I think that when we went into COP Copenhagen, there was this idea that solving climate change was addressing a really big problem. And now I think that people also recognize, in addition, that it is creating a huge opportunity, which gets us back to the business community that sees that the technologies of the future, the low carbon energy technology of the future, the energy efficiency technologies of the future, are going to create enormous wealth and opportunity for entrepreneurs and business leaders, so they're part of the answer now.
Well, and this is a fascinating theme, particularly for you, given Rocky Mountain Institute's links to what was called Natural Capitalism, a very influential book when it was first written, I think about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
At the time, it was seen as a bit heretical, this notion that we could make money by making the world greener. Is that now almost a mainstream position?
I would think so. It's quite remarkable how the founding father of Rocky Mountain Institute, Amory Lovins, has consistently over the years been a prophet ahead of his times. And you're right, when he first published the Natural Capitalism book together with Paul Hawken, it was seen like something
that weird.
You can't sort of mix the green and this environmentally conscious with the desire to make money. I think now many companies are great illustrations of the fact that the future is in a sustainable, low carbon, circular business model, and that the future is really on the side of those that are quickly transitioning to that model and making it harder and harder for those who lag behind. So that is in some ways a hereditary view of 20 years ago that now has become the mainstream.
Indeed. Well, I think we're going to leave it there. So thank you very much for watching, and thank you to Jules for his contributions. And we will have much more from you here this afternoon from Paris City Hall. Thanks for watching.